all different ways. Sometimes people come in a crisis and you don't have a lot of time. I think that honestly, it doesn't really take a lot of time if you're available and you are willing to be vulnerable or to connect with people. Those connections happen immediately, very, very rapidly.
You're listening to Parent Projects, a family media and technology group production. Now here's your host, Tony Siebers.
Hey everybody, welcome back this week. We're welcoming back into the show Dr. Jody Stern, who is becoming a fast friend for me. We are an unlikely bunch talking about something today that we generally in our professions don't talk about. We're trying to kind of compartmentalize and maybe set that away, which is all the more reason why I think where we're going to go with the conversation is going to be something interesting. Dr. Stern's a board certified neurosurgeon. He's an inventor. He's a published author. We're going to talk a little bit about his book, Grief Connects Us, which is an amazing uncovering in a story of his own journey about his losses and how he saw that from the eyes of a trained physician and what that looks like. So welcome us in, or I'm going to welcome him back in. Dr. Stern, Jody, how are you today?
I'm very well, Tony. Thanks. Thanks a lot for having me.
Well,
it's great to be here.
It is awesome to always have you back onto the show. You are you're brilliant in your capabilities to harness some challenging situations from your personal life, be able to put that perspective from what you learned professionally in that, and you communicate it really clearly down to folks. So I'm excited to get to dig into a bit of this challenge when people are talking of families that have grief and how they start working their way through it. So thanks for breaking that down.
It's really a pleasure. I'll tell you, I kind of this wasn't an intentional journey, and I think maybe you'd say the same, which is I came to this through illness and loss in my own life. First, my younger sister Victoria had developed leukemia, a very aggressive kind of leukemia. When she was 52, I was 54. And she had a bone marrow transplant, which her son was the donor for. And then she died less than a year later. And she wrote a journal of her illness. She said she wanted it to be a one-act play of surviving leukemia. Instead, it became a testament for her dealing with illness and what she had to go through. And so I wrote a book incorporating her journal. Then, while I was still writing it, her husband, a year and a half later, Pat, died of a ruptured aneurysm in his brain. And he was in a coma for a week. And I had to put off my neurosurgeon hat and become a family member. But it was a neurosurgical catastrophe. So I knew everything really well, but from a very different perspective. And then we had to let him go, and orphaning their two children. And it was such a devastating experience, far more for them than for me, but it was so profoundly shaking. And so I kind of felt compelled to write this book. And one of the things that I learned was that this experience that I went through is not unique. It was just my experience. But everybody has similar painful journeys they go through, horrible losses. We all tend to try to deal with grief. I interviewed in the book physicians and patients and talked with them about their own experiences. And they gave me strength and a feeling of that I wasn't isolated, I wasn't alone, that we all have a similar language, that we are connected. And then in the latter part of the book, I tried to put forward some ideas of how we could do a better job as health systems, how we can be kinder to each other, kinder to ourselves, more supportive, and that compassion really needs to be the foundation of what we do as in medicine and in caring for other patients and people. And after that, I went and got training in palliative medicine to get a better idea of what, learn the skills that I was advocating for. So it's been a real life-altering, life-changing journey for me. When we talked before about how, I wouldn't it was awful, and I wish it had never happened. And yet these experiences have taken me to a place that um, I, I'm a better person, or a different person, having gone through them.
Well, and you have that you thrive in that and help other folks thrive in that because you have a perspective that allowed you to see what needed to be shared. I think for a lot of people, including myself, there is the military aspect where we came through. One thing that really resonates in hearing your story, and I can't help but draw somewhat of similarities in how just from a matter of professionally, I was trained classically to work one way for an emotional survival, and I had a bump in the road, honestly, with a little bit of law enforcement that led me to understand this was even important. And I say a bump in the road because I don't think that was part of the whole training plan for the military get go. That wouldn't have been where it was going to go. But it just, man, it wouldn't leave me. Once I had learned it and I had heard it, then it just kind of buzzed around and it stuck out there. It was itself something that, it wasn't something I would have seen as a great success of my life. It was like this little side quest. And I didn't know that I understood the value of that until later when I ended up having, and I lost my sister. We've talked about that last year, coming up on a year now this month. And in that may be truly one of the first times that I could not only working through and counseling maybe the family of a fallen soldier or some other group of persons there, or someone at the end of life. Now, I'd had family members die at natural end of life, but just the shock and awe left behind, her adult children that she left behind as well, of 18 and 22. And these are big shifts of things that led me to just sit back and go, okay, well, what do I think I understand about what this is doing to me? What's the impact on me as I'm coming through? And I guess maybe one of the first things to dive into as we set this up, outside of knowing where we both kind of come from and that we've decided we're going to have this conversation regardless, is situational awareness. What's the maybe laying kind of some of the grounding of some concepts that you learned throughout your experiences or you see out there? What is grief? Is this just a thing that happens to us every time? It's just going to pop up every time something bad happens? Is it something that sits out there and underlying? What have you learned from your experiences that we should be thinking about there?
Well, first of all, grief can be really bad, catastrophic things like people dying, loved ones, losing loved ones. But I think to a degree, we deal with grief on a regular basis in our lives, whether it's disappointments or losses. And we all have, this is sort of what creates the color in our life. This is what, we talked about, well, is this cause sadness or cause joy? The truth is, grief is what allows us to experience joy, and successfully moving through grief or allowing ourselves to experience it. A lot of times we tend to try to cover it up, bury it and say, I'm going to go through this catastrophic event. For me, it's, a patient dies, and for you, we talked about, a soldier falls. You've still got to go through the action. You can't step back and allow yourself to experience it. But if you don't experience it, if you don't allow yourself to get through it and to incorporate it, to integrate it into yourself, then you sort of damage yourself. You create these walled off areas of yourself. And if you never really work through the grief that we go through, it's actually, I think it's very toxic, and it's very unhealthy and unhelpful. So one of the things I think that I wanted to establish in this book is that, I have gone through grief. I've had some training as a physician. I understand some about disease. I've really not had enough training in terms of managing grief and going through it, personally, and how to incorporate it in my life. And I think that's one of the things that we need to do a better job in medical education.
Mm-hmm.
But when patients are coming to me, or when people are, experiencing loss or are afraid and feel alone and feel unsupported, and that this is a very isolating experience, I think it's really important to kind of hold their hand and to realize and to bring them in and say, I understand what you're going through. I've been through something like this, and you don't need to go through your own story, but knowing that I have gone through this, that I have an understanding of what other people are going through, I think is a powerful healing part of being a doctor and also being a decent human being. And we talked before about how we need to have a lot more kindness for each other, we're all suffering. We all are going through these losses, and we're all fearful. I mean, ultimately, we're talking a lot about caring for parents who are aging, but then behind them, there's us. And you look and you go, I'm seeing things I don't really like. And I know, like, I'm looking at my hair and saying it's going away. I'm getting older. And these are inevitable. We're all going to get sick. We're all going to die.
Right.
We need to support each other. We need to be kind to each other, and we need to connect with each other. And so I think one of the things we also talked about is that we also need to prepare. So when we are facing mortal illness or loss of capabilities, that's the time we need to start talking with our loved ones about what's going on and about what we want and how we want to be cared for, and having these conversations. Because there's a lot of times that our tendency is to be afraid, to pull back, to put on a wall, the emotional armor we talked about.
Right.
And I think you have to put that down. I don't think it really helps. And in the short term, yes, if you're in a battlefield, you can't, fall apart. But if you never fall apart, then you really never get through it.
Well, and the
I mean, I
reality
don't
is,
know. I want to ask you: does that sound right? Because you're the guy who's gone
yeah,
through that.
I would say you don't ever not fall down from that. It's just a matter of, man, there's some other phrases that I've heard. Maybe when you're dealing with a parent project sometimes, or if you're professionally guiding a family through something, one common saying is, if you don't know where the family's going to get involved, you probably won't like where the family's going to get involved for your project. Grief works a lot like that. It is and I think you just laid a good groundwork against it. It's just a real thing, because it's not just a massive loss of somebody falling down there. It could be a fact of you got a command you weren't expecting off of that. You're apart away from your family. You are watching two soldiers make a mistake in something that they're doing. And it's just really disappointing to watch that thing happen within their life. Or, like, grief comes from disappointments and letdowns at some side. There's different levels of where those things are at, but they all come into play. And so I would say, you're right. There's a tactical mission that needs to be accomplished. And compartmentalization can provide for that in a military perspective. It can tell us, okay, until this is complete, that's where that is. But as soon as you've completed, the closest thing we really had was, you complete and you have actions on the objective. Once you get to what your objective is, you complete these things that needed to be done, gather what needs to be gathered, make that assessment from that all. Then you package all of that up and you move on to what the next thing is, and you reconstitute. First thing you do, you park all your vehicles back in, you gas everything back up, you put new ammunition with it, you set yourself up, back everything in so that you are prepared to go immediately again when you're called back on. Part of reconstitution is allowing, like, that steam to blow out, or where this pressure release valve. I don't talk about this a lot, but one thing that really concerned me a lot in Iraq in particular was, I remember coming off, we'd come off and out of moving someplace or have some challenges. You come put the trucks away, and everybody would head down. And what was really common at that point in time is they'd play video games. They'd go down and they'd have a big television, and they'd jump into a Call of Duty, and they'd run the same route that we just ran.
Wow.
And they'd be doing it on the video game. Like, within 20 minutes of coming off and having a significant emotional event happening off of that.
Right.
And I remember walking past the room and being like, man, this is, we're going to have to unpack this someplace, because I don't know. And maybe that is unpacking that, right? That's allowing them to slow down for that moment, because at the moment you weren't allowed to process where that was, and that gives them that opportunity to do that. So I think that grief is, if you're really taking, we call it situational awareness in the military, if you're being situationally aware of what you're walking into, whether it's a parent project, or it's a surgery maybe, or a mission, or a small tactical mission you're working through. You've got to have that awareness of what's going on with everyone around you. And what I love what you said here was that touch of connections, what can come out of some of that connection. Kindness is a great way to start a connection. Mercy is a great way to start a connection. Authenticity is a phenomenal way to start a connection, particularly when emotions are raw and tingling. I found in my career and in life. Does that resonate with you, or is that with your experiences?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the other thing I think, this is one of the things that I also have been writing about, is that we really, as physicians, are not really trained in how to manage these things. And one of the things I was advocating for is emotional agility, which is you have to be able to flex between a lot of different experiences, and you have to have contradictory things occurring at the same time. So for me, I have the battle readiness, that I go and do an intense surgery, and I have to be very focused. I also have to be emotionally connected to that patient and the family and navigate those things. So I think that takes a lot of training. I also think that people who can do that are ultimately the doctors or the people you want to be with, because
Yeah.
they are, I guess you'd say, they are the leaders. They're if you deal with people who get kind of sidetracked with distractions and don't master those areas, I don't think you can really do a good job if you're never emotionally available to a patient. But also, if you're only emotionally available, you got to walk the line. You got to be able to have all of those skills. So I think it's a real challenge. But ultimately, if you're able to do that, I think that's where you find joy, satisfaction, and real meaning. And when I look on my career and I look at, it's not the really crazy technical surgeries that I have done that stand out for me. It's the people that I have helped and kind of held their hand and walked them through illness or been available to them. And it's those meaningful relationships and connections that I most value and that really stand out for me.
Does a lot of those connections in those interactions that stand out in your mind, were they opportunities to connect prior to an inciting event of the surgery, or would you say maybe afterwards?
Kind
Was
of
it?
both. I mean,
Yeah.
people come in all different ways. Sometimes people come in a crisis, and you don't have a lot of time. I think that honestly, it doesn't really take a lot of time if you're available and you are willing to be vulnerable or to connect with people. Those connections happen immediately, very, very rapidly. But then some of the things that have just, I remember there was a guy, he had a hemorrhage in his brain, was about to die. We did surgery on his brain, and he came back to my office like months. We really thought he was going to die. He came back months later, walking, talking, not fully recovered, but so much better. And just to be a part of that, or to be able to kind of witness that's so powerful. So I
Yeah.
guess that's not maybe it's a grief that there's grief and loss. For him, he had loss of capabilities and wasn't able to go back to his job that he used to do. But at the
Right.
same time, he had his life and he had his family. And so I think that in dealing with grief and loss, there's also there can be some maybe some peace, or maybe some acceptance, some maybe a new beginning. So there's a lot of, like, for example, we
Or
talked
hope.
before.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I have had personally, had an injury to my arm, to my dominant arm, where I've had to stop doing surgery.
Right.
And that has been a huge loss for me. But it's also, and so I would say I've experienced grief in dealing with that. And yet, having kind of worked through that, it is now a tremendous opportunity. I'm sitting here talking with you. I'm writing books. I'm exploring, I think, ways that we need to change or do things differently. And I think that has meaning and value. So when one door closes, maybe another one can open.
So when it, and I think more than just open, one thing that I take that a step further and state that every door closing has shaped me moving into the direction I like literally needed to move within. A
Hmm.
100%, 100% of what's happened to me is what's formed my ability to tackle what's in front of me. And one of those things changing would have dramatically impacted that.
Hmm.
And so in finding that value, I mean, we've talked previously having an understanding of purpose behind things. I think there's a I wish I could remember exactly who said it, but it's something along the lines of when people understand why, they can deal with a whole lot of how or
Hmm.
something
Sure.
right
Sure.
into those areas. That why seems to be something that's like carved into the heart of mankind of constantly where would that sit, where would that come from. And what I've noticed in my experiences in life, and then now over into the parent project stuff, is those that have come to understand a why someplace, or have become comfortable with that, some level of transubstantialism, or some level of higher power,
Hmm.
or that whether it's they believe in a god, or they believe in just something that's bigger out there, that there's going to be a purpose, maybe allowed them to find that path of hope in suffering, or something from that standpoint. How does that how does something like that play out with what you've seen?
Well, I think that there's definitely a spiritual component of all of these experiences, and I think that some people who have faith or who have belief also seem to have a lot of uh, get to acceptance maybe more easily. But I think that it's not a prerequisite. You don't have to have a established religion. I think that you can recognizing that there are forces greater than yourself, recognizing that
Right.
we're bigger than just merely being individuals, connecting with each other, and I think um, walking with each other, recognizing that we are we're in a world that's bigger than just ourselves. I think allows me to get to a level of peace and acceptance that I find reassuring.
Yeah. And so working, here's you were talking about connecting with families before and after surgery and things. One thing that came to mind to ask in these conversations as they maybe unfold for you. I've had a couple of surgeries now, never a brain surgery, but about how long from the moment in which you are tactically doing, I'm going to use the word tactically, but you're doing the surgery, you're in
Hmm.
that moment and working from what that is, where maybe you're at the height of compartmentalization to stay focused in what it is. How long generally is it before you then have to go have some level of some conversation with somebody that is with that follow-up conversation? We see I've been on the table. I haven't been standing out in that waiting room, but I know my wife had said someone, surgeon came right out afterwards and talked. That seems like
Sure.
it's a pretty like expected to be a pretty quick gap of time for you
I mean,
to
switch
change.
flexing from one role to the other.
I mean,
It is
yeah,
pretty
with
quick.
that. Well, and that's interesting. You even say one role to the other, because the reality is like the family's not seeing it that way, right? It's just
Right.
seen as it's the role.
Right.
That's the
That's right.
expectation of you. So what is
Mhm.
how long does of time does that is that really that quick of a train? I mean, it's like you
Well,
complete,
I
you
mean,
wind up
in a brain
doing.
surgery, they can take hours. They can be fairly short. Usually, brain surgery is at least a few hours.
Okay.
But then you have to do a lot of routine tasks like dictate, write notes, check the patient afterwards, then go. It's at least a half hour or so before you go and talk to a family member. But
Okay.
It's more. I think it's less amount of time and more kind of psychological space. Being able I think I talked about this in my book and in an article, but when I was training, I went out and talked with a family member after a really complicated brain surgery, and I kind of missed the opportunity to speak honestly about what was going on because it was a pretty devastating tumor, and I always felt badly about that because I really didn't allow myself to be honest and really explain what was going on. Later, after I went through with my sister and brother-in-law, that really changed, and I think maybe it's some emotional maturity, maybe it's some age, maybe it's having some losses myself, but I'm much more comfortable sitting down, talking, holding hands, saying really what's going on or what this all means.
Yeah.
But it's daunting to step into that reality and be vulnerable and be honest and connect with people. But it's important. It's kind of it. If you don't do it, it really sticks with you, and if you do it, you can make a huge difference,
I,
almost as much as the technical part of taking out a tumor.
Yeah, well, and I agree. Even from the other side, being able to walk through and process those other people that are impacted, long term. I have been, I've stood on the, well, yeah, I've stood on the tarmac at that backside as somebody's come home, right, and sat
Mm,
with the
mm,
family,
mm,
and escorted through that week, at a very personal connection, right, to understand what that feels like and how it works, and that opportunity where you touch in. Um, I want to kind of jump back. My mind was thinking back. I'm always looking for these great opportunities in which we can take time to step back and prepare ourselves, or better, like, where can we change direction if we're moving in the wrong direction, or where can we
mhm,
give ourselves a good opportunity to put better practices in play. You talk about, when you come out of surgery, you then go through, you have some transcription that happens, you're making your notes, you're working off of that. In a very similar way, when we come on, as soon as you come off the trail, you're immediately, as an officer, I'm sitting down and I'm filing my reports. This is what I walked through. Same thing in law enforcement, right? As soon as you've been through that, you sit down, you walk through, you write your reports, you get out a lot of stuff. You're actually trained also at that time to know, like with formal training, that, um, you have to process that in a very deliberate way, because if you received, or you walked into that, maybe you're responding to an accident or a car accident, or a loss, your brain is going to perceive things very differently
mhm.
in the first couple of moments, and it might actually remember things a little bit differently over
Sure,
different prolonged. Okay, I'm glad that makes sense to you, because
sure, sure.
other than just hearing it told to us and then living through it and experiencing and going, oh my gosh, I literally remember this differently the first 15 minutes than I did the next 15 minutes after that. And
Sure,
then
sure.
even the next day as I came back, I'm like, oh, it's like that this other color kind of came into that. I digress.
Mhm.
Uh, that moment, though, we both have that moment that's built into the schedule after going through something where maybe grief could happen, or where something difficult has happened, and high intensity to process. Could we
Mhm.
build something into that time? Is it maybe as soon as you've seen, or you've recognized that event has happened, and you're working with somebody that may be in grief, giving your space that time to pop out and to begin processing it at your own level, instead of running right into trying to process. Is there something in there? I'm thinking there might be a nugget of
Well,
value.
I think, my son is in medical school right now, and he is, I've talked to a number of medical students. I teach them in the medical humanities program at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and um, they have described how, they're like the first death that they've encountered. There really wasn't time or a built-in moment to process or to help people process it. And if you're a doctor and you maybe have done this for 20 years, that may not be disruptive to you because you've gone through this a lot, but it can be terribly traumatic or disruptive for a student. So we need to really build in some um, time to process, time to adapt, time to kind of work through what's happened. And I think if we don't allow ourselves to do that, it really is a disservice. And I think the message to the student is kind of, I got to get my act together. I got to put the wall back up. I got more to do. You got the same thing in the military. I've got to go out and run another mission, and you try to push that stuff away, and it doesn't go away. So I
Right.
think that part of managing grief is giving it its time, allowing ourselves that time to kind of think things through, to process them. I have found writing to be really helpful, and taking the time to think things through. If you don't do that, and if you don't allow yourself the time to kind of go through those, there's no way to finesse it. There's no way to kind of just avoid it, or somehow push it away and pretend it didn't happen. That I think is very damaging.
Yeah. Well, in I think it being pragmatic. I think many people will come into where they discover that there's this big situation that's going to cause grief to work from that, and chances are they're very quickly going to have something else to have to deal with. And so they're not going to get to fully process off of that. I love the journaling idea. I stink at writing. I wish I really want to. In fact, if I could pick what I would do in the world, I would write. I love the idea of it. I just can't do it. But I record.
You're doing a podcast.
I know. I've learned I can record.
You find your path.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think is interesting is that there's a lot of these things are not really linear, right? You don't have a grief moment, an intense moment, get through the grief, then you're on to the next. And, like if you take X amount of time, it'll all be fine. We experience and relive our grief over and over again.
Right.
And I feel that a lot of times the hurts or the damage or the things that we never really kind of got through or processed, they keep coming back, and so, one of the things that I learned from that experience with that family that I felt I didn't do a good job is I didn't get a do-over with that family, but I had a chance to do it right the next time. So I feel like this is all part of life, learning how to go through these experiences, managing them, and then growing from them, and realizing that they're going to come back and they'll revisit themselves, and that all just by being available, by being open and supportive and humble, maybe, I think it is really powerful, really helpful.
I think you're more than helpful. I think it's something that is, in some levels you'll have a responsibility. If you feel compelled to lead someone through a situation, or you've got that level of responsibility here, I think you have to build in some protection for yourself that makes you at least take stock of, okay, so now I can't deal with this right now. Chances are it's going to impact me someplace. Where is it going to impact me? Keeping your eyes open to it. I want to, when we come back, we're gonna take a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Jody Stern. We're talking about working with people in grief, and again, when we come off of that, let's talk about preparing, having these discussions sooner than later, preparing yourself to come into that here on the Parent Projects podcast. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Hello, my name is Joseph Stern. I'm a neurosurgeon and author of Grief Connects Us. My book bridges the gap between patients and their doctors and invites us to open our hearts and improve our communication and gain mutual understanding and appreciation. If you're going through your own grief, or if you're a family member of someone who has died and are grieving, or if you're facing illness yourself or wanting to plan for your future instead of reacting after the fact, then this book is for you. If you're a medical student or nursing student or a physician or nurse, this book is for you. I provide readers with tools to enable them to get through their own grief and to grow in the process.
And welcome back. Again, this week we're sitting down with Dr. Jody Stern. We're talking about working with people in grief. Dr. Stern, you've obviously written the book on it. You're brilliant. You're literally a brain surgeon, as it comes up. The humility with which you tackle grief is commendable, and I'm not just throwing that up to butter you up for this. One thing you've made really clear when you and I have talked before is it's important to talk about the processing and preparing ahead of time. If you can prepare for the conversations you're going to go into. I mean, we talked about maybe even, are there ways we can do that in these little gaps or windows between major events and discussing them to prep for that conversation. In preparing for a discussion, what's something that helps you prepare for a difficult discussion that you're going to have with somebody?
Well, first, I think I kind of reach out to your audience because, I'm thinking about a lot of people who are struggling with, logistics of aging parents and having to downsize or having to, change their living situation. There's so many big, kind of frightening topics that are kind of looming out there, and I think that it's scary to bring them up. It's scary to kind of lean right into them and say, let's talk about this, and let's, talk about what your death, how your death, what your death might look like, or what you want, what you value, your funeral, your living will, all these things. The fact is, if and it's while it's scary to do that, it is really scarier to not do it. And by kind of passing the buck or just sort of saying I'm not going to do it, we lose an opportunity to kind of make a big difference and to uh, have some courage, to plan and to discuss those things. I will tell you that the difference between patients and family members who have living wills and advance directives and have talked about all these things and those who have not is really huge. I think in our country it's about 30% of people that have actually done this. So a
Right.
lot of your audience, it's really worth it for them. And it's one of these things that we say, kind of leaning into a difficult situation or being emotionally honest or available. It's scary to do it. I'm so glad every time I do it. If I don't do it, I feel bad. And I think
Yeah.
this is the same. And I'll tell you also, I've got an aging parents. I face this. It's really hard. But ultimately it's very rewarding, and also it's very comforting. So I think that when you've had these discussions and we've gone through the trouble of having the documentation and the kind of, really discussed all these topics, it actually takes a load off. So it's you think that kind of going into it is scary and, upsetting, but the reality is it is a little upsetting up front. It's a whole lot of relief for everybody down the road. And I
Yeah.
also think the other thing is that if you do that with your parent, you're also in a position to do that for yourself, and I think that's hugely important too. So as I am dealing with aging parents, I recognize I don't want to beat this into the ground because I said this before, but I recognize I'm kind of next in line. You're kind of filling into that, you're stepping into that spot. All of these things, I do not want to burden my kids with having to make these decisions. When Pat was in the coma, he had a living will, but he was locked in a safe deposit box. And so we couldn't get access to it. So we had to make all these decisions almost blind. And it would have been so much easier if that had been out there and available to us. So I think that really we owe it to ourselves. We owe it to our family members. We owe it to our kids to have these discussions, to make these plans, to take the initiative. And ultimately, I would just say that when it's hard to kind of deliberately take on discomfort, disquiet. You feel ill at ease. You're asking questions that are awkward. It's painful. It's upsetting. It may cause tears. But not having the discussion is not going to prevent what's coming, because
Right.
we are all aging. We are all going to die, and we should all prepare. And then I think it's a whole lot easier if we have this awareness and this preparation. It's a gift to the medical team that's taking care of your family member, because they have some support, they have some guidelines. It's a whole lot easier for that person. And the trouble is, what was interesting for me, I mean, interesting is probably not the right word, but it was my sister when she was dying. Her bone marrow transplant didn't take, and her platelet count dropped, and her cancer came back, but she was conscious throughout the whole time. Then she had a cardiac arrest and died kind of suddenly, but she was able to kind of steer things along. The problem was she wasn't willing to talk about the idea that she might die. She thought that if she was going to die, if she said that, it was going to make it happen. So she missed that opportunity to say goodbye to her kids and to make some plans. And I think that was sad and very difficult. My brother-in-law had the opposite, where he was healthy and then had a hemorrhage and he was in a coma and he never woke up. So we didn't have the opportunity to talk to him about what was going on. We had to make decisions for him. And I think it's really hard if you're a family member to take, when people have to make those decisions, they have to make the decision that says not what I want, right? I don't want my
Right.
loved one to die. It's what I'm representing this person's interests, right?
Right.
So that's a very selfless and difficult position to put yourself in, where you say, well, I want you to stick around, but I think it wouldn't be fair for you to continue in what may be a hopeless situation, and let you go. But it's a whole lot easier if you have some of that grounding and you've had those discussions, and we are able to make decisions. Because a lot of times, a lot of the treatments and the in-hospital deaths are not really they're not ideal. They can be prolonged. There can be, you really want to kind of minimize suffering as much as possible. And it's really helpful to have those conversations in advance when you can. And you talk about people with dementia, right? If you wait too long, you really can't have those discussions,
Right.
and it's very hard for me as a surgeon. I saw this just all the time. People come in the middle of the night with a hemorrhage in their brain and no family around and no guidance. And I have to make decisions with limited information. And then you say, well, if the person was in a nursing home and they were not, really independent, the default position may be I've got to do the surgery, because if I don't do the surgery, then they're going to die. But if I do the surgery, am I really doing that person or that family a favor? Putting them back in a maybe more debilitated state. And I don't have the ability to make all those decisions myself without guidance. And it's one thing if you have, it all spelled out, or people have had these discussions, so they already have gone through these things and have made those decisions. It's very different if it happens at 3 a.m. and it's a crisis and you have no time to reflect or to have a, kind of considered conversation.
Yeah,
So
well,
I would say that people need to just kind of jump in and be willing to do this.
the other is that sometimes that is, especially maybe in a dementia or something like that, it's a long goodbye. There is
Mhm.
a prolonged period of grief that you're working through, and so you might be dealing with that very quick decision. You're in such a rhythm of this long rhythm where it sits, and then all of a sudden there's this inciting incident that happens
Right.
that demands attention and focus against all these other things that have happened. And it is not the best time to depend on memory.
Sure.
That's
Sure.
not the best time to work from that, right? And so that
And
preparation.
if someone is losing their faculties, the time to talk about that is as soon as possible,
As soon as possible.
because you don't know what's coming, and you don't know how much capacity they'll have or how much they'll be able to understand things.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's really hard. I think one of the things that I think is really difficult is if you don't have these discussions, then you carry a burden of guilt, of, well, I made a decision, but maybe it was the wrong one. And, I wish I hadn't done this, or, what if things had been done, it had been different. And I think people are very afraid of making the wrong choice and feeling guilty or responsible. And I think so having these discussions and having these advanced directives takes some of the burden off. It's
Yeah.
all, you've gone through this. The person has said what they want or what they would want, what they would wish for.
And I think sometimes that difficulty. So we look at what I'm a military guy. I like acronyms, right? So all of the issues, or these issues that tend to drive or make it difficult. If you're having a hard time having this conversation out of a loved one, an aging loved one, your mom or your dad, your aunt, whoever it is that's aging off of that side, oftentimes being able to speak in and to recognize or understanding upfront when you're showing kindness to them.
Mhm.
Top things that we've at least seen in the Parent Project realm so far: autonomy, legacy, and then loss. These are these three things that sit out there. So it's loss, they've lost mom's lost dad, dad's lost mom. It's a shift of life, of responsibility, of those types of things. It's changed the dynamic of what's going on, along with just loss, the same thing that we will eventually also face. Just when you lose, when you hit that inevitable end of life, which we all share. Legacy from that, how someone's going to be remembered. That is, we see a lot in men sometimes, and not that women, it doesn't impact them the same way, but men especially want to be remembered, and how that is. I think there's something that's built in us someplace of how that comes down. To shoot, my youngest kids are already challenging me for my my lands and titles. So I think there's definitely something that's a part of how will I be remembered when I go, and then their autonomy, the ability to go to handle things on your own and to make your own. You might beyond making own decisions and decision making, but carrying them out and working from that concept. And so when in defeating that, if you see or you recognize a family member off of that, things that I know we've worked through is in the senior move management world and in other, and just really around this industry, it is leaning into being able to, we call it a lean-in culture, ways to help them, what that is, help them get more autonomy, make that the goal of that first goal in order to calm everything down and establish that trust, which is probably there someplace, blow the dust off of it. And I'm going to help you with autonomy off of this, or the legacy. Talk to me about how you want to be remembered from that. Acknowledging, right. Here's an easy one. You're not going to bury yourself. You can't right. bury yourself. No one's been able to pull that off yet. If you figured it out, let me know. But outside of that, I'm going to have that responsibility. And I want to do that in the way you want to be remembered. Walk me through that. Just have me from that. And it's okay if we get emotional while doing it, but I really just need to understand that so that I don't have to be figuring that out, at 4:00 in the morning when I'm struggling from losing you the night before and trying to put it together.
I think that, how you, first of all, I think one of your listeners they're to be commended because they care and they're invested in their parents' well-being and they want the best for them. And I think you can phrase or shape all these arguments or these discussions out of a positive basis and out of love. And what is really hardest is when people are isolated or alone or unsupported. And so the fact that you're there and the fact that you're trying to kind of tackle these things is huge. But you're absolutely right. You can start the conversation as, we're going to talk about death, right? That's a negative. So, but maybe you flip it and say, hey, let's talk about how you want to be remembered or what you want to live on after you are physically dead. And how can we honor you and your wishes so that you are, we care for you and we care for your memory and we care about you. We honor you, and it's an act of love. It's an act of support. It's an act of kindness. It's that connection and fighting the isolation and the loneliness, because when we don't talk about these things, it doesn't make them go away. You just bury them in you. And that's a net negative, and that's scarier than facing it.
Well, you leave it to be guessed at later. And that is,
and we'll never do as good a job as if I'm taking care of you and you're in a coma. I'm guessing, right?
Right.
If you've led me, and given me some points of how to manage things, I'm going to do a much better job for you.
Right. Which is right. And you're guessing. You're only increasing our biggest fear, which is failing at that or not delivering what we could be doing or should be doing, or the best version. So I love that. Love that you brought up the word love within that. Kindness, showing love. Okay, so those are fluffy things. These are not things that surgeons and soldiers talk about.
Not soldiers and nurses.
This is not that. But
when you said I watched your interview with the hoarding expert.
Oh, Matt
And it was,
Matt Paxton, probably,
yeah,
right?
and it was fascinating to me because I never really understood it. But then when you start to recognize is, people are they're craving relevance, and they're craving meaning, and it's this almost irrational sense that if I just keep everything, I'll still matter. And
Right,
what he did was say, well, let's choose a few things that are important to you, and tell us the story. Include us in your life and tell us about why those are meaningful. Well, it's the same thing about advanced directives. It's just, I mean, the form is not the form is a legal thing, but the conversation is what matters. It's
right,
taking the time, and being kind, and it is a positive gesture. It's a gesture of love. It's a gesture of support. It's a gesture of saying that you matter, and that I'm yes, I'm afraid to talk about these things, but I'm willing because it's important, because I love you and care enough about you that I want you to be your end to be as peaceful and as I guess pleasant as possible.
right.
So I think you can easily put a positive spin on it, but the opposite of just sort of saying, oh, you're gonna pack your house full of stuff, and we're just gonna deal with that, not manage it. It's the same thing. How do we handle our emotional baggage, and our fears?
Yeah, those are, well, you sparked, going back now a couple of years. One of our first episodes dealt with how to say goodbye, in dealing with that, and we were working through, the guest, or in the articles we were working through. She was talking about telling her like 6 or 7 year old child who was dying of cancer, letting them go, right?
Mhm.
And giving these magic words. What are the magic words? What do you say to somebody that's passing, and working off of all that? Which is in its, I mean, you think of a child, it just grabs you from that standpoint. But speaking into, the same terms of what you're talking, what the understanding of what she had was, letting them know, one, you're not going to hurt anymore.
Right.
You're not going to hurt anymore from this point ever. It's not going to be something you ever have to deal with. And another key portion off of that was saying, and we're going to be okay. Like,
Right.
we're
Right.
good. We're going to be fine off of this side. What was really fascinating against what she had to say was that the way she processed it on the backside was turning all of that backwards, and then internalizing those same words back off of where this was, as words of comfort into the
Mhm.
situation,
Sure.
helping her process. But um, giving, again, I guess maybe, also giving time. What we were talking about, when you come out of that major event, before you go in as a doctor, maybe, and have that conversation, or before, we write that time to write the report and to work through in a process and think through that. I'm reminded also, in approaching somebody with a difficult conversation, giving them a kind of a heads up.
Mhm.
In the military, they say generals never like to be surprised. Don't ever surprise a general, right? You're gonna tell them what you're gonna tell them. You're gonna give them time to set up for that. Then you get to go in there and tell them what you're gonna tell them. Then afterwards, you tell them what you told them. That that approach has fared pretty darn well for me,
Right.
as I've had to work through some people, giving them that time, and then using, the kindness, the mercy, the love, those things. What that really, it's empathy. It's me
Mhm.
giving that's practically trying to apply some level of empathy to read them.
Right.
They need time to process this to get to it. It doesn't mean it goes away forever. And there will be some people who just shut down. Confused mind says no, and they're going to try to avoid that. I think
Right.
that would let you. That's always actually let me be able to. Well, sometimes I just think through. Well, is that what I needed to talk about? Maybe that wasn't what I needed to talk about, but this and this and this, I need to talk about those things.
Right.
And so when can I get approach up? I'm like, hey, I'm going to throw this. I'm going to throw this one out,
Right.
but I really do need to talk on this and this and this, and we've let that out and prepped it. How does that play out with your
Well,
experience?
I think that, the bargaining, I think it's hard when people lose their autonomy, as you said. They lose their
Yeah.
driving privileges, and they feel like they're being kind of whittled away or chipped away. And I think, so small victories are have a lot of meaning. You say, okay, there's 5 topics we need to talk about. We're gonna, you don't want to talk about these 2. Let's talk about 3 of them. it's a give and take, and
Yeah.
the other thing is you can revisit it, more than once. So I think that, I think the empathy part is huge. And I think the recognition of how scary it feels to lose that autonomy, to, the whole idea of moving into assisted living, or, and what comes with that, what huge, there's a lot of legal and paperwork and decision making and logistics, but there's also a lot of emotional, freight that comes with it. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
But I think if your listeners realize that, pat themselves on the back and think, well, I'm here, I'm supporting, I care. That's a lot of what's important.
Without a doubt, and truly to the man or the woman in the arena, it matters that you show up. It matters that you're here. And my hope is that our conversation today and our experiences here, neither one of us being experts in grief,
Right.
but can just lay out how we had to find our way through off of this, being ones that weren't supposed to focus on it. It's a real thing. It's not going away. And I hope that helps. And I appreciate that. Go ahead.
Yeah, as do I. And I find it fascinating talking to you about kind of the military part of it. And, I think that the wisdom I've gained, I'm very grateful for, and I also need the help in facing very tough situations.
Well, you're a true friend of the show, and to me, I really appreciate it. I love having you on here again. I look forward to having you back again. Hey, talk to us about where to go to see Grief Connects Us, especially if somebody's in the medical profession off of that, or if they're a family where that especially might be speaking in, and there may be a great opportunity. But where can people find more about the book that you have out right now and the other stuff that you're doing?
So I think if you go to my website, which is josephsternmd.com, it's got a lot of resources. You can buy the book through Amazon or independent booksellers, and there are links there. There are also links to, I have several articles in the New York Times, and then also the Washington Post and other journal articles, a TED Talk, a bunch of talks. So and we also have a newsletter, and which kind of tries to create a community where people can get resources and support each other. And so I think that's an important part as well. So that's a good place to go.
Loving that.
You can also contact me by email through that website as well, if you want.
Great. And we are going to put all that, by the way, down below in the show notes. So make sure that you check in against that. And if you're looking at this, whether you're on social media feed of this at YouTube, or if you're out on the website, you can find us at parentprojects.com. And a lot of these resources as well, we'll be linking back throughout the site, because it is gold. And boy, I can't tell you again, Jody, thank you so much for sharing your time, talents, and treasures with us and the Parent Projects audience. Thank you.
Tony, thanks for what you're doing. I think you're making a big difference.
Thanks be to God. Thanks, man. Well, that's it for the team this week, and thanks for joining us. If you've enjoyed the content, remember to subscribe and to share this episode on the app that you're using right now. Your reviews and your comments, they really help us expand our reach as well as our perspective. So if you have time, also drop us a note. Let us know how we're doing. For tips and tools to clarify your parent project, simplify communication with your stakeholders, and verify the professionals that you choose, you can find us on YouTube, follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks again for trusting us. Until our next episode, behold and be held.
Thank you for listening to this Parent Projects podcast production. To access our show notes, resources, or forums, join us on your favorite social media platform or go to parentprojects.com. This show is for informational and educational purposes only. Before making any decisions, consult a professional credentialed in your local area. This show is copyrighted by Family Media and Technology Group Incorporated and Parent Projects LLC. Written permissions must be granted before syndication or rebroadcast.